The airfield was already alive long before sunrise, engines grumbling against the cold, men shouting directions over the metallic clatter of tools, and a thin layer of dust swirling with every passing truck. Pilots walked with quiet purpose, scanning the sky out of habit, while mechanics hunched over open panels and exposed engines, fighting time itself before the next mission launched. Among them moved a man nobody noticed at first glance. A man whose work rarely earned praise, rarely made reports, and rarely left the ground. His name was Thomas Hale, and he was about to change the entire air war without ever firing a single round. Hale's uniform was always stained with fuel, grease, and oil. His sleeves were permanently rolled, his hands covered in scars from slipping wrenches and hot metal. Most men saw him as just another mechanic, one of the countless workers who kept the P-47 Thunderbolts flying. But those who knew him understood a simple truth. Hale had a way of seeing engines the way artists saw colors or musicians heard notes. Where others saw machinery, Hale saw potential. He wasn't supposed to be on the front lines. His transfer papers had been filed incorrectly, assigning him to a combat maintenance unit instead of the stateside research group that originally requested him. By the time anyone noticed, Hale had already arrived at a muddy airstrip in Europe surrounded by half-repaired fighters and tired crews. He didn't complain, he simply went to work. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster of a machine, thick-skinned, heavy, loud, and capable of taking punishment that would tear other fighters apart. But it had a problem, a big one. The German Messerschmitt Me 109 was lighter, climbed faster, and in the right hands could run down nearly anything. Pilots loved the P-47's ruggedness but hated watching Me 109s catch or escape them at will. The Thunderbolt simply wasn't meant to outrun one, at least not at low altitudes. But Thomas Hale wasn't convinced that was the end of the story. His obsession began on a cold morning when a P-47 taxied in with a sputtering cough. The pilot climbed out shaking his head, exhausted after fighting a German fighter that disappeared into the distance, while his own engine refused to give him the extra power he needed. Turbo fell off again, the pilot muttered, kicking the dirt. Feels like it's alive 1 minute and dead the next. Hale knelt beside the aircraft, listening as the engine ticked softly in the cool air. He knew the P-47's secret weapon was its turbosupercharger, a massive, complex system that forced air into the engine at high altitudes, making the fighter a powerhouse in thin air. But down low, turbulence, heat, and rapid throttle changes caused issues. The system lagged, it spiked, it surged, and sometimes it flat out refused to cooperate. As the pilot walked away, Hale leaned in and inspected the turbo plumbing. Something bothered him immediately. The pipes were shaking more than they should. The turbine housing vibrated irregularly. The wastegate, the mechanism that controlled airflow, was sticking just enough to cause instability. But even that didn't explain everything. He noticed soot streaks around the gasket, signs of minor leakage. Minor in isolation, but devastating when combined with rapid power changes during pursuit. The turbo could choke on its own airflow. The engine wouldn't fail outright, but power delivery became unpredictable, just enough inconsistency to lose a chase. Hale wiped the dust off his hands and stared at the assembly for a long moment. The war had taught him one thing: no failure ever happened alone. One problem hid another. One flaw masked a bigger flaw, and this wasn't an engine problem. It was an airflow problem. That night, as rain pounded against the tin roof of the maintenance tent, Hale sat alone with a flashlight, a pencil, and a grease-stained notebook. He sketched out the turbo system, tracing every line of piping, every valve, every hinge, and every weak point he had seen over the last few months. The P-47's turbosupercharger was brilliant on paper, but in brutal field conditions, mud, cold, dust, and constant battle damage, it became temperamental. The wastegate especially was prone to sticking. Its purpose was simple: regulate how much exhaust gas entered the turbo. Too much gas and the turbo overspun, too little and it starved. Pilots needed immediate response in a dogfight, but the wastegate could lag seconds behind. Seconds that cost lives. Hale circled the wastegate on his sketch. Then he circled it twice more. The next morning, he asked the maintenance chief if he could take apart the assembly for a deeper inspection. "Why?" the chief asked. Hale shrugged. "Something feels off. Engines feel off all the time. This is different." The chief sighed but didn't argue. Hale's instincts had proven right too many times to ignore. When Hale opened the wastegate housing, he felt his chest tighten. The hinge wasn't just sticking, it was warping under heat stress. Dust and micrometal debris collected in the pivot, creating tiny friction points that multiplied under throttle changes. Hale stared at it with the same expression he might have used examining a wounded animal. This wasn't a repair issue. This was a design flaw. He cleaned the hinge, replaced the gasket, lubricated the joint, polished the actuator rod, and reinstalled the assembly with perfect alignment. The pilot tested the aircraft the next day and returned with a smile he hadn't worn in weeks. "Feels tight, feels strong," he said. "Feels alive again." But Hale wasn't satisfied. One aircraft wasn't enough. He needed consistency. He modified 2 more, then 5, then 10. Each time performance improved, not dramatically, but reliably. Pilots reported smoother throttle response, cleaner climbs, faster acceleration at low altitude. Hale kept studying each report, looking for patterns, refining his adjustments, smoothing hinge lines and polishing airflow pathways until the modifications became an art form. Then everything changed in a single mission. A P-47 pilot named Dawson took off with one of Hale's modified turbos. His squadron ran into a group of Mi-109s diving out of the cloud layers. A brutal dogfight erupted, engines roaring and wings cutting tight arcs through the sky. Dawson broke off to chase one of the fighters. Normally this was suicide. Thunderbolts didn't chase Mi-109s, they were outclassed in pure speed. But not this time. Dawson shoved the throttle forward and the engine responded instantly. The turbo stayed spooled. The airflow stayed steady. The wastegate didn't hesitate for even a moment. The P-47 surged forward with a ferocity Dawson had never felt. He caught the Mi-109s. He passed the Mi-109s. He stunned everyone. Later that afternoon, Dawson landed and jumped out before the propeller had even stopped turning. "What did you do to this engine?" he shouted. "I ran down a 109, I outpaced him in a climb." Mechanics gathered around. Hale walked up slowly, wiping oil from his hands as Dawson continued. "He couldn't shake me. I pushed her to the firewall and she just kept going." The chief looked at Hale. "What exactly did you modify?" Hale hesitated. The wastegate assembly, the airflow path, the hinge contour, a few alignment angles. The chief blinked. "Without authorization." Hale nodded slightly. "Yes." The chief stared at him for a long moment. "Do it again," he said quietly. And Hale did. Within weeks, every P-47 on the field had been modified with Hale's insane turbo fix. Pilots reported incredible improvements. They hit speeds in low-altitude bursts that rivaled German fighters. They climbed harder. They escaped traps. They controlled fights they used to avoid. Hale worked day and night. He polished metal until it gleamed. He filed hinge edges until they moved like silk. He smoothed airflow pathways inside pipes not meant to be touched. He adjusted angles by micrometers, tiny differences with massive effects. But the German response escalated too. More Mi-109s arrived. More aggressive tactics. More pressure on American squadrons. Hale felt the weight of it all. Every fighter that took off carried his modification. Every life depended on the consistency of his work. Every mission risked exposing his mistakes. One evening, a pilot limped back in a damaged P-47 with a smoking engine. The turbo housing had taken a direct hit from flak. The aircraft barely survived the return flight. Hale rushed to the runway, climbed onto the wing, and inspected the engine compartment. The damage was catastrophic, but not complete. The turbo was cracked open, but the airflow assembly Hale had adjusted remained intact. The wastegate hinge still moved, his reinforcement contour still held, the airflow path hadn't collapsed. The pilot said, voice trembling, "If the turbo had locked up, I wouldn't be here. She held just long enough." Hale swallowed hard. It wasn't pride he felt, just relief. But the truth came crashing down on him. His fix worked, but it wasn't enough. The P-47 could outrun me 109s in bursts, yes, but not for long, not consistently, not across every altitude. Hale realized something terrifying. The war had changed, and he needed to change with it. He began studying the turbo deeper, not just the wastegate, not just airflow, everything: pressure regulation, thermal expansion, exhaust dynamics, turbine spool inertia, mechanical lag, hydraulic modulation, pipe resonance. He pushed deeper into the problem until his hands shook from exhaustion. Then one night, one long, quiet night, he discovered the flaw that changed everything. Not in the turbo, not in the wastegate. In the asterisk pressure equalization line asterisk, a thin, overlooked tube responsible for smoothing transitions during throttle changes. Under stress, it vibrated, creating oscillations in turbo speed. Those oscillations slowed response time, just enough to cost a pilot a chase. Hale stared at it for almost an hour. This was the real enemy. Not the hinge, not the wastegate, not the piping. This vibration, this resonance, this flaw hidden in plain sight. Hale grabbed a wrench, then a file, then a strip of heat-tempered metal, then a torch, and he began to work. Not a repair, a reinvention. He rebuilt the modulation line with a vibration-dampening brace and a slightly altered internal contour. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, nothing that changed regulations. But everything that changed performance. The next test flight shattered expectations. The P-47 didn't just outrun a Mi-109. It left one behind so fast that the German pilot abandoned the chase. And Hale knew he had found it. The pilot who flew the first test run came in fast, almost too fast, barely managing to stop the P-47 before reaching the end of the runway. When he jumped out of the cockpit, he didn't speak at first. He just stared at the aircraft, almost as if it had transformed into something unrecognizable. Finally, he turned to Hale. "What did you do?" he whispered. Hale didn't answer immediately. He had no interest in excitement. He wanted proof, hard data, consistency. But the pilot grabbed his sleeve with trembling hands. "I pushed the throttle past the point it usually chokes. No lag, none. The turbo never dropped. It held. It just kept holding. I climbed past a 109 like it was towing a truck." Hale nodded slowly. He already knew. He had seen the numbers on the test bench. He had felt the resonance disappear. He had listened to the smooth, uninterrupted whistle of the turbo spool. But hearing it from a pilot, hearing real-world confirmation, made his chest tighten. The maintenance chief approached with a half-skeptical, half-determined expression. "I want this on all our aircraft," he said, "immediately." Hale hesitated. "It needs more testing." "No," the chief said firmly. "Our pilots don't have time for more testing." So Hale went to work. Word spread instantly. Pilots gathered around, demanding to know what had changed. Mechanics rushed to learn the process. Officers quietly approved the modifications without bothering to clear them through command. Everyone understood what they were witnessing. The P-47, a fighter once mocked for being too heavy, too slow, too clumsy, was transforming into something entirely new. A low-altitude monster. A pursuit predator. A machine that could finally chase down the German aircraft that had terrorized Allied skies for years. The effect was immediate. On the next mission, a squadron of P-47s engaged a flight of Mi-109s emerging from broken clouds. Usually the Germans initiated the chase, but this time something different happened. The Thunderbolts closed the distance. The first German pilot went into a shallow dive, his usual escape maneuver, but the P-47 behind him stayed glued to his tail. The turbo didn't sag, the power didn't fade. With Hale's fix, the engine maintained full thrust even through quick throttle transitions and abrupt altitude shifts. The German pilot looked back, expecting to see distance grow between them. It didn't. He dove harder. The P-47 stayed with him. The German pilot panicked and pulled into a climb. The P-47 climbed faster. When the American guns opened up, the Mi-109's wings snapped back violently, trailing smoke as the pilot belayed out. What stunned everyone wasn't that a German fighter was shot down. That happened often. What stunned them was the chase. P-47s weren't supposed to catch Mi-109s. Not like that, not at that altitude, not with that ease. But the reports kept coming. One pilot returned shouting, "I ran down 2 of them, not 1, 2. Another said, "They can't shake us anymore." Another said, "It's like flying a completely different beast." And then the most revealing comment of all. The turbo never quit, it never sagged, it never hesitated. Hale heard these words again and again. Each time he felt the same mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. Satisfaction because the fix worked, anxiety because now he had to keep it working. War had no room for failure. Not at altitude. Not with lives in the sky depending on his hands. As the days passed, the new performance of the P-47 rippled through the squadron. Morale surged, missions changed, tactics shifted. For the first time, American pilots felt like they could dictate the fight rather than react to it. But with every improvement came new pressure. And the German response didn't take long. Luftwaffe intelligence picked up on the sudden change. Their pilots reported that P-47s were accelerating faster, climbing harder, and holding power longer than before. Something had changed, and the Germans needed to understand what. German mechanics began studying wrecked P-47s. Engineers analyzed turbo systems they recovered from crashed aircraft. They knew the Thunderbolt's turbo was complex, but nothing they found explained the sudden leap in performance. Because Hale's modification was subtle, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A slight contour shift, a small brace, a nearly imperceptible modulation angle. It wasn't a new part. It was a new idea. But even with the advantage, danger escalated. As P-47s pushed harder, so did their engines. Turbo housings glowed red-hot after missions. Pipes rattled under strain. Pilot demands grew. Squadrons begged for more power. Hale found himself facing a feeling he hadn't felt in years: fear. Not fear of battle. He wasn't a pilot. Fear of failure. If even one aircraft crashed because of his work, he would never forgive himself. One morning, after a particularly chaotic night of repairs, Hale stood beside a P-47 with the cowling open. The heat still radiated from the turbine housing. He touched a gloved hand to the metal. It felt like a heartbeat. The pilot approached. "She held together," he said quietly, "but I felt something shudder on the way back." Hale climbed onto the wing and leaned in. He found the problem almost immediately. A vibration crack. A small one, but a dangerous one. The turbo was enduring more pressure than ever. The brace he had added helped airflow, but it didn't fully eliminate turbulence under rapid throttle changes in combat. He needed something more. Something bigger. Something that fundamentally changed how the turbo handled stress. That night he didn't sleep. Not even for a minute. He studied airflow charts. He inspected metal fatigue patterns. He made sketches until his pencil wore down. And then, just before dawn, he realized what he needed to do. It wasn't about reinforcement. It wasn't about airflow smoothing. It wasn't about hinge adjustments. It was about heat. Turbo lag wasn't only caused by airflow inconsistencies. It was caused by thermal inconsistency. Uneven heat distribution inside the turbo slowed response and increased stress. If Hale could correct the temperature gradient, he could stabilize the entire system. But the solution he imagined was radical. So radical that no manual covered it. So radical that every mechanic he worked with would call him insane. He didn't care. He retrieved a strip of high-temperature alloy scavenged from a wrecked bomber, heated it until it glowed, and hammered it into shape on a makeshift anvil. Sparks flew as he shaped the metal into a curved baffle, something that would redirect heat inside the turbo housing to maintain consistent temperature across the turbine spool. A thermal equalizer. Crude. A simple. Completely unauthorized. But if it worked, it would remove lag entirely. The next morning, he installed it in secret. The pilot who tested it returned speechless. He stepped down from the cockpit and pointed at the engine as if trying to find the words. "What did you do?" he finally asked. Hale stayed silent. The throttle feels connected, like the engine isn't thinking anymore, it's reacting. Other pilots demanded the fix too. Mechanics crowded around asking for instructions. Officers began filing informal reports about unusual improvements in turbo stability. Hale worked faster. He installed the fix on aircraft after aircraft, refining the shape, smoothing the contour, adjusting the fit until each turbo responded like a living thing. And then the moment that changed everything arrived on a clear afternoon. A squadron of P-47s encountered a group of Mi-109s escorting bombers. The Germans dove, fired, and climbed, classic hit-and-run tactics meant to exploit their superior acceleration. But this time, the Thunderbolts didn't fall behind. They didn't lose momentum. They didn't lag in response. They surged. One P-47 passed a climbing Mi-109 so quickly that the German pilot later reported he thought the American had switched engines with a rocket. Another German pilot radioed, "Thunderbolts climbing like devils." American pilots came back laughing, exhausted but victorious. One said they tried to run, we ran them down. Another said 109s can't get away anymore. Another said whatever Hale did, he gave us teeth. And that was the moment the officers finally recognized the truth. Hale's insane turbo fix didn't just improve performance. It changed the entire fight. It changed how P-47s engaged. It changed what missions they could attempt. It changed the war in the air. But Hale didn't celebrate. He didn't even stop working. That night, while everyone else slept, Hale sat alone beneath a P-47 wing with tools scattered around him, the last rays of sunset fading in the distance. He looked at the metal, the pipes, the turbine housing he had modified, and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Pride. Not because he wanted credit. Not because he wanted recognition. But because men who would have died now lived. Because pilots who once feared the chase now sought it. Because the Thunderbolt once mocked now ruled the sky. And because somewhere overhead, P-47s roared with a power they were never supposed to have, but now did. In the weeks that followed, Hale's world changed faster than the weather rolling across the airfield. The P-47 squadrons that once struggled to keep up with German fighters were now returning with stories that spread through every tent, every briefing room, every pilot hut on the base. Stories of Mi-109s trying to climb away, only to be run down. Stories of Germans diving for escape, only to be matched and overtaken. Stories of entire enemy formations breaking apart in panic when Thunderbolts appeared on the horizon. Pilots stopped approaching Hale with frustration and instead walked up wearing quiet smiles, shaking their heads like they still couldn't believe what their aircraft had become. They used new words now. She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't sag anymore. She feels lighter than she should. She's finally faster than the fight. But for Hale, victory didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. Every improvement he made invited new risks. The P-47s were flying harder, pushing deeper into enemy territory, and putting more stress on engines that were operating far beyond their original design limits. Each time a pilot came back with good news, Hale nodded, but always felt the same quiet fear in the back of his mind. Machine tolerances were not infinite. Metal fatigue was not a rumor. And war never stopped demanding more. One night after the squadron returned from a brutal mission where half the aircraft showed signs of extreme heat stress, the maintenance chief found Hale sitting alone on an overturned crate, staring at the glowing turbine housing of a recently landed P-47. "You look like a man waiting for something to break," the chief said. Hale didn't look away from the engine. "Everything breaks eventually." The chief sighed, "But not today, and not because of you." That didn't comfort Hale. He understood machinery in a way few men did. He knew when metal was hiding cracks beneath the surface. He knew when weld seams whispered signs of weakness. He knew when bolts were one thermal cycle away from snapping. And on that night, looking at the glowing red turbo, he felt something he hadn't felt since the beginning of the war. A limit, a line, a boundary the P-47 couldn't cross without collapsing under its own power. But if the war demanded that the Thunderbolt keep crossing that boundary, Hale needed to find a way to push the line further. Not for speed, not for glory, not for reputation. For the pilots, they were the ones flying into flak storms. They were the ones facing head-on passes. They were the ones returning with missing wingtips and bullet-torn rudders. Hale worked for them. And so, even though his fixes were considered miraculous, he refused to stop searching for weaknesses. He began studying the turbo beyond airflow and heat. He looked into torsional flex, the subtle twisting force produced when the engine and turbo were out of sync. He noticed faint stress patterns forming in the turbine's mounting bracket, faint enough that most mechanics would ignore them. Hale didn't. He realized that at high power the turbo wasn't simply spinning. It was pulling, tugging, twisting. Minute amounts, yes, but enough to introduce micro-vibrations that propagated through the entire assembly. And that meant one thing. The turbo wasn't fighting air. It was fighting itself. This discovery kept him awake again, hunched over schematics by lamplight, sketching possible solutions on the same notebook that had started the entire journey. He considered dozens of ideas, some too complex for field work, others too theoretical for wartime. But then he remembered something simple. A small stabilizer bracket used in bomber engines to counter torque resonance. If he could apply that principle to the P-47's turbo mount, scaled down, reshaped, angled correctly, maybe he could prevent torsional drift entirely. It was worth trying. He scavenged for parts through scrap piles. He cut and heated metal until sparks filled the hangar. He hammered, bent, and tested dozens of prototypes. He burned his gloves. He bruised his knuckles. He ruined his last good set of pliers. But early one morning, as the first pale light crept into the hangar, Hale held a bracket in his hand that felt right. Engineers always spoke about equations and measurements, but mechanics like Hale knew something deeper. Sometimes metal told the truth if you listened. He installed the bracket on a P-47 just minutes before takeoff. The pilot didn't know what Hale had changed. He simply asked, "Will she hold?" "She'll hold," Hale said. The pilot took off. The test wasn't gentle. It wasn't cautious. It wasn't measured. The squadron encountered a group of Mi-109s prowling along the front line, and the sky erupted into twisting arcs of exhaust and gunfire. In the chaos, the P-47 with Hale's new fix dove steeply, pulled hard, rolled violently, and surged forward each time the pilot slammed the throttle. Back at the airfield, the pilot stepped out shaking his head. "It's different," he said quietly. "She feels smoother. The turbo doesn't shake anymore when I hit it hard, it just responds." Hale exhaled slowly. It worked. That night, more aircraft received the bracket. Then more. Then all of them. The P-47 became something extraordinary. Not just powerful, not just reliable, not just fast, a smoother. Her acceleration curve no longer wavered. Her turbo spool no longer fluttered under stress. Her throttle response became instantaneous. Her low-altitude performance soared. German pilots began reporting something unusual. The Thunderbolts accelerate unnaturally. They respond too quickly. They are no longer predictable. The Mi-109, once feared for its speed and climb rate, suddenly found itself losing both advantages. But as American confidence grew, German desperation rose with it. The Luftwaffe began sending more fighters into every engagement. Ace pilots received orders to target P-47s specifically. New tactics emerged designed to disrupt the Thunderbolt's newfound stability. Yet mission after mission, P-47s came home stronger than before. Until one day, a day Hale would never forget, the war threw its hardest test at him. A squadron of Thunderbolts was returning from escorting bombers deep into enemy territory when they were jumped by more than 30 Mi-109s. The battle lasted nearly 20 minutes. Engines overheated, wings tore under stress, turbo housings glowed like molten iron. Hale stood on the runway watching the sky, listening for familiar engine notes, praying silently in a way he had never prayed before. One by one, the aircraft appeared. Most were damaged. Some were barely flying. All were exhausted. But they were alive. One of the last aircraft to land rolled in on a wing that looked like it had been chewed. Smoke trailed behind it. The engine sputtered unevenly. Hale sprinted toward it as it slowed to a stop. The pilot climbed out, stumbling. "I thought she was going to die on me," the pilot said. "But every time she staggered, the turbo kept catching me, like she refused to quit." Hale inspected the turbo. It was nearly destroyed. Heat warped, bullet scarred, cracked around the edges. But inside, the thermal baffle he had installed remained intact. The vibration dampening bracket remained tight. The wastegate flowed smoothly. The pressure modulation line held firm. His fixes had kept the engine alive long enough to bring the pilot home. "Your work saved half the squadron today," the pilot whispered. Hale just nodded, too tired to speak. From that day onward, the P-47 Thunderbolt earned a new reputation among German pilots. They didn't call it the Jug anymore. They called it something else. Der Unaufhaltbare. The Unstoppable. Not because of its guns. Not because of its armor. Because of its engine. The engine Hale had transformed. Weeks later, Command sent an engineering team from the States to inspect Hale's modifications. They expected a miracle. They found something better. They found practicality. Hale's fixes weren't glamorous. They weren't theoretical. They weren't even proper by regulation standards. They were battlefield logic, crafted by a mechanic who understood the language of metal better than the language of bureaucracy. The lead engineer asked him, "How did you figure all this out?" Hale shrugged. "The engine told me." The engineer paused. "And what did the engine tell you?" "That it didn't need power," Hale said. "It needed balance." The engineer wrote the line down. By the end of the war, Hale's insane turbo fix, along with his heat equalizer, pressure modulation contour and torsion bracket, were implemented across hundreds of P-47s. Squadron reports showed the same trend everywhere. Faster acceleration, better climbs, reduced turbo lag, higher pursuit success, fewer engine failures, more pilots coming home. No medal carried Hale's name. No newspaper told his story. No reporter interviewed him after the war. But every P-47 that outran a Mi-109 carried his fingerprints on its engine. Every pilot who made it home owed a part of their life to a man who never left the ground. Every turbo that held together during impossible maneuvers bore the quiet genius of someone who simply refused to accept that good enough was good enough. Hale never sought recognition. Instead, after the war ended, he packed up his toolbox, placed his battered notebook inside, and walked away from the airfield as calmly as he had walked into it. He returned home with no medals, no fame, no uniform worth framing. But in the quiet spaces of history, where the truth of war actually lives, something became clear. The P-47 didn't just outrun Mi-109s because of its design. It outran them because one mechanic refused to stop working, refused to stop improving, refused to stop pushing. He gave the Thunderbolt a new voice, a new heartbeat, a new life. And because of him, countless pilots saw the sunrise after battles they would never have survived. He didn't change the war by flying. He changed it by listening.